Hello, and welcome back to the final session of Liturgy of the Ordinary, a book discussion on the book by Tish Harrison Warren. There it is. I'm Peter Pettit at St. Paul Lutheran Church in Davenport, and joined by
Pastor Kendra Thompson, also on staff at St. Paul Lutheran.
We've been enjoying this read of Tish Warren's book, Liturgy of the Ordinary, and the way in which it sets up daily life, the ordinary, and worship, the formal liturgy, as parallels and mutually reinforcing experiences in the Christian life. Today we come to the final chapter, chapter 11, on sleeping, a very ordinary experience. Which Warren parallels to Sabbath and rest and the work of God, and really talks about how Sabbath and rest and sleeping are all about learning how to let go.
Definitely. With that phrase, Peter, I thought of a bumper sticker I used to have, not on my car, but it said, let go, attachment is prison, or something like that. And so I thought of that as I was thinking of this letting go. There's something very rebellious, I want to say, or countercultural to slow down and to let go, relinquish control, because there's so much in our culture that says, you got this, you can do this, you don't need anyone to help you. You can be anything you want to be. And we forget that the shadow side of that is that it's very oppressive to feel like we have to do everything and that sort of thing. So there's this great quote from chapter 11, where Warren says, our workaholic, image barraged, over caffeinated, entertainment addicted, and supercharged culture. This is how she describes the way we live. And there's no rest in that. It's just this like frenetic image. And so pursuing rest, pursuing sleep, is to let go of that reality, that's the only way to go, the only way to live.
She points out that as infants, human beings actually have to learn how to go to sleep.
Mm-hmm.
They have to learn how to let go. And indeed, every night, in order for us to survive, we have to yield ourselves to sleep.
Mm-hmm.
But our effort is to deny or limit it, or is to deny our human limitations.
Mm-hmm.
And as you were saying, this is the message we receive from our culture, that there are no limits. Nothing should stop you. Nothing should slow you down. Nothing should limit your freedom. And so we push in order to try to fit as much into every day as we possibly can, burn the candle at both ends. And as a result, we end up really sleep deprived, among other things, and without needed rest. Came to the point in 2013 that the Center for Disease Control and Prevention declared that insufficient sleep is a public health problem, as 40% of Americans don't get enough sleep.
Yeah, we're supposed to get 7 or 8 hours, and she said most folks get maybe 5.
Yeah.
And I've also read that at some point, if you're sleep deprived enough, it's like you're drunk. It's like you're intoxicated.
Yep.
So there's the risk, the public health risk.
Right. Sleep deprivation behind the wheel is just as dangerous as being under the influence.
I worked with a minister in Kansas. She was a youth pastor, and she told me she would turn off her phone when she went to sleep. Novel idea. But what she would say when she did that is, God can handle the night. And I'll never forget that. There's something humble in that, saying you know what, I don't I don't have to be on the clock during this amount of time.
Right.
And it, it reminds me of this this psalm, which she mentions from Psalm 127. Unless the Lord watches over the city, the watchman stays awake in vain. It is in vain that you rise up early and go late to rest, eating the bread of anxious toil. For God gives sleep to the one God loves. This idea that sleeping it doesn't mean that you're weak. It means that it means you're human and you're receiving this gift of rest from God. So we have a couple questions for you to consider. For what am I willing to give up sleep? And how often do I lose sleep through overcommitment to something or anxiety about something? So take a moment, pause the computer if you'd like, reflect on these questions, and we're going to move on to thinking about rest as it relates to worship.
This whole idea of letting go that Warren encourages and that she sees the Christian life encouraging just isn't easy. And as we look at the 20th century and our experience, the early 21st century in America, it has moved us increasingly toward greater insecurity, economic insecurity. Think about the wealth gap and the way in which the class is being eaten away. This even before coronavirus, and Lord only knows what's happened to anybody's pension savings at this time. But already before that, economic insecurity, which then leads to health issues, questions about retirement, housing insecurity is greater, and what we might call legacy insecurity. What am I going to be able to leave for my kids or do for the next generation? So all of that insecurity tends to make us want to do more, to be more active, to try to assure things within our control more and more and more. And if we want to rest and we want to relax and we want to let go, you need practice at that. Warren says that worship gives us that practice.
Yes. We talk about this liturgy. It's the part of the word title of this book, liturgy, and it means the work of the people. And this is something that when we show up for worship, we're all participating in. But it's not like every week when we show up, we have to create the prayers and the songs and the order all over again. It's there. It's this ancient thing that we step into and we collaborate with. But it has something to teach us. Yeah, in worship, we show up, we abide, and we rest. I mean, if you think about it, like where else do you sit still for 15 minutes, half an hour, and listen? This is becoming more and more rare, I think. So that's part of it. And she talks about this, in the 19th century, there were circuit riders. So these were, ministers who had more than one church that they were in charge of, and they were far apart. They were kind of these like Wild West ministers.
Literally on horseback or in the buckboard wagon, moving from chapel to chapel or community to community.
Yeah. And I wasn't aware of this, but it wasn't uncommon for them to work 90 or 100 hours in a week. And that was almost the expectation.
Wow. I'm a slacker.
I know.
But there it is again, right? They could work 90 or 100 hours a week. I must be a slacker.
Yeah. And the response to that, I mean, this is almost comical. The response to that wasn't, oh, maybe we should rethink how we minister. It was, well, we need to create a fund for these worn out pastors so we can patch them up and get them back on their horses working 90 or 100 hours a week.
Right.
So I really appreciate that she lifted up the wrong-headedness of that.
Yeah.
Because propping up those sorts of systems, I mean, who needs God, right? If you just have this circuit rider who doesn't need to sleep and is bringing everyone salvation.
Right.
So
Right.
I appreciated that she brought that up. I would not have made a good circuit rider unless there was like, a job share where like maybe I worked a quarter of it and you worked 3/4. Then I could
Thanks.
do it.
Yeah, absolutely. I got your back, Kendra. Yep. But she talks about how while we kind of scoff and marvel and recognize the challenge and all that, she says that really is our legacy in many ways. We are worn out ministers, worn out parents, worn out business people, worn out believers, and it affects our worship together. We're prone to embrace a faith full of adrenaline, excitement, and activity. We have to learn together to approach a Savior who invites the weary to come to him for rest.
Mm-hmm.
This famous verse from Matthew 11, "Come to me, you that are weary and heavy burdened, and I will give you rest."
We're no good to anyone if we don't, like what good is a burnt out minister or a, so sleep deprived mother that you're practically intoxicated? Like, that's not good. What's good is be able to offer something from this deep well of nourishment and rest. Then we can be our best selves.
It strikes me as such a paradigm change, such a shift in perspective to think about relaxing our way into worship rather than charging into worship as a performance. Warren talks about that in her own background. Worship was expected to be an occasion when you reached an emotional peak or you did your own part in lifting up the community in worship, and it sounded almost exhausting to be a part of it. And then she talks about ending up in this small Anglican chapel with her husband with the traditional liturgy. And it's not that this is the only way to worship, and it's not that enthusiastic worship in itself is problematic. But if we don't have the idea that we come to worship in order to be renewed rather than to do more work, then we're missing something.
Yeah.
And that's what she was able to find when she said, "I was learning to rest in a new habit of worship, a way of approaching God that was less reliant on my own energy, effort, or emotional state. I showed up to church like a person drowning, energy spent, and arms weakened, and collapsed on the words and practices of the historic church like a life raft."
So with that image in your mind, we have a couple questions for you to ponder. What parts of worship are most relaxing, most refreshing for you? Are there aspects of this worship practice that can help you gain relaxation and restoration on a daily basis? So take a minute, pause the computer if you'd like, reflect on those questions. And we're going to move on to thinking about learning from creation. When we think about what we read about creation in Genesis 1, there's this rhythm of starting and stopping, of night and day, of the rhythm of saying it was good, and then the rest. There's this quote she has from Eugene Peterson, that we go to sleep and God begins to work. And it's another one of these letting go things that when we go to sleep, we recognize that we're not in charge, that we're not ordering the universe, that is God's job, not our own.
Again, I think of this as the kind of paradigm shift that Warren offers us. Just as with worship, we come in not to do more work, but to rest and to be renewed by God. So here, thinking about that pattern of evening and morning. And we think, oh, I get up in the morning, the day starts. I race through the day and I collapse into bed. And what Peterson helps us to see, and Warren lifts it up, is that this rhythm of starting the day in the evening, as Genesis says, it was evening and it was morning, the first, second, third, fourth day. And so to come to bed, not draining ourselves as far as we possibly can and then succumbing to sleep as a concession to our weakness, but rather start the day by committing ourselves to God's care and formation through the night so that we can rise in the morning to be God's ministers in the world. Just a whole different way of thinking about what night and sleep are all about.
Yeah, there's this quote also from John Bailey. God is at work in us and in the world even while we sleep. And it made me think of my smartphone. So periodically you get these updates, but you can it only works if your phone is plugged in. So your phone has to rest for it to update.
Yeah.
And I think we're similar. We, at some point, same with computers, at some point you have to turn the thing off so that it can work better in the morning.
And so it can install those updates.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
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 That's a great image.
And I think there's humility in that as well, both the Eugene Peterson quote and this John Bailey one, that we're not doing it all ourselves, that this transformative work comes from God, and we get to be the conduits of that grace and that work that's happening.
Yeah, one of the other pieces he talks about is it's not that we create things in the world, it's that God is already at work in the world, and we join God in doing what God is already doing.
Right.
And part of that is that God is renewing and strengthening and empowering us through our rest, through our sabbaths, through our sleep, and through our worship, in order to be God's partners as priests and ministers in the world. Brings us to our last question, and that has to do with how, if we learn to rest in part from worship, is there some way that you might alter your pre-bedtime routine to shape it more around committing yourself to God's care and formation? I think it's customary for us to ask for God's protection through the night. Luther's evening prayer asks for God's protection, as well as God's looking out for those who cannot sleep at night, the essential workers of public safety and utilities and all sorts of things. And we're accustomed to asking for God's protection at night. But I think what Warren leads us to here is this question about committing ourselves to God's care and formation through the night. So that, again, as Bailey, I think it is, says, we wake in the morning better people than we went to sleep.
Yeah, I like that.
So is there a way that we can alter pre-bedtime routine to shape it more around that thought? Take a moment to discuss this. Pause the video, if you will. Discuss it with anybody who's with you or reflect on it. And then we'll be back to wrap up this series, actually.
Yeah, Peter, I mean, we read a whole book.
We did.
Pat yourself on the back. But it has been delightful. It's been delightful to discuss this book with you, Peter. It's one of my favorites. I've read it half a dozen times. But also to have this opportunity to continue something that began as a Lenten study that we thought we were just going to pick selections from, and we were able to go through the whole book. So we thank you for joining us and for the feedback you've given us. the thumbs up and comments and things like that. And we look forward to seeing you in the future. We're not sure when or what we'll be doing, but this has been a fun adventure for us, and we hope to continue something like this at some point.
Thank you much, Kendra. Look forward to being able to be back together for face-to-face conversations one day soon.
Yeah. Indeed.
That would be so ordinary and so well.
Yes.
God bless.
Mm-hmm.